I was asked by some of the sisters to actually record the audio for the slideshow. So I'm going to be doing that, but please, this really is not a lecture, alhamdulillah. So feel free at any point to contribute if you have a comment or a question, inshallah. I don't know. Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. So, Assalamu alaikum again to all of you, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from us that we've come together today to really try to prepare for this blessed month that is approaching, subhanallah. And I want to start by saying that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the companions came to him and they had a very serious and very genuine concern. And they said, "O Prophet of Allah, should we be encouraging people to do good? Should we be enjoining that which is good if we ourselves have not perfected it, if we haven't, really gotten it perfectly yet?" And the Prophet ﷺ actually encouraged them and affirmed that yes, you should encourage others. You should tell people to do good even if you haven't perfected it yourself. All the while striving and struggling and making that, inner struggle and jihad against your nafs to perfect your own worship and your own actions. So it's really with that spirit that I am presenting this talk today, because I don't in any way absolve myself of the advice that I'm going to share with you all. I feel like, as I was preparing this, was the one most in need of this advice and of that mental and spiritual preparation for the month of Ramadan. So really, I just wanted to begin by saying that I know that every year, we were just saying, subhanAllah, every year around this time, we think we're like, oh, a year has passed? Could Ramadan really be coming so quickly? And we start to think, how did the time go so quickly? And we wonder, well, what can I do to prepare? And I think that a lot of the topic related to Ramadan preparation is sort of like a to-do list, right? And we think, okay, I need to start doing this, and I need to start focusing on that, and I need to do this, and I need to do that. And so because I don't want anyone to walk away today disappointed, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from us, first and foremost. But I want to give me and you some very practical points in the beginning of things that we can start working on right now. The first of those, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith Qudsi tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, "My servant does not draw nearer to me with anything more beloved to me than that which I have made obligatory upon him or her." So the first thing we need to do as we start preparing for Ramadan is look at the obligatory acts of worship and do our best to improve them. And really, I think the number one thing that stands out in my mind is our salah. So we have 5 opportunities a day with which to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by the way, this is not prepared. What I'm telling you now, this is not the talk. These are just some practical points that I felt I had to address in the beginning before we even got into the talk, because the talk actually looks at Ramadan from a whole different angle. But I wanted to give us some practical things so that we would have them fresh in our mind in the beginning, because really, if we don't prepare, subhanAllah, Ramadan will begin and we will have to spend the first few days trying to catch up. So we have to from now. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the fara'id, the obligatory acts, are the most beloved thing we can do to draw closer to Him. So every day, 5 times a day, we have the opportunity to connect with Allah. The word salah comes from the word sila, which means a chain. It's a link. So a lot of times we rush. I will say about me, I will feel rushed in my prayer. I feel like I have so many things I need to do. It's time to pray. It's dhuhr time. I want to pray sunnah. Okay, let me just get these rak'ats and pray and be finished. But then I sat with myself and I said, salah is not meant to be like this. Salah is not, if it's going to have the effect that it is supposed to have, I cannot approach it just like something on my to-do list that I check and I move on with quote-unquote life. Islam is life. Islam is a deen, and the word deen encompasses something that is holistic. It involves everything we do for our Creator. So the fara'id, the 5 prayers, and then the Prophet ﷺ used to always pray the 12 rak'ahs of sunnah the sunan mu'akkada that were associated with those prayers. 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, 4 rak'ahs before Dhuhr, and 2 rak'ahs after, 2 rak'ahs after Maghrib, 2 rak'ahs after Isha. Those are 12 extra units of prayer that the Prophet ﷺ used to almost always pray. It is one of his sunan that he did not leave. So as we are trying to get ready for Ramadan, let us start there, focusing on that, because the hadith goes on, the hadith Qudsi goes on, that my servant does not draw closer to me with anything more beloved to me than that which I have made obligatory upon him or her. And then he continues to draw closer to me with those extra acts of worship, i.e. the sunnah prayers and the sunnah fasting and the supererogatory acts of worship, until I love him. And when I love that servant, I am the eyes with which he sees, the ears with which he hears, the mouth with which he speaks, and the hand with which he strikes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of all our affairs when we draw closer to him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So really that's the first piece of practical advice. What other piece of practical advice in the very beginning can I mention? The Prophet ﷺ used to fast extra in Sha'ban. So he used to perform extra nawafil fasting. So if you are able to fast in this month, it is something that is highly, highly encouraged. Islamic tradition, emphasizes that fasting is something that elevates us spiritually and gives us a softness of the heart that nothing else can do. And really that's what we're going to talk about today. So as we go away today, if you take only 2 of those 2 practical points, I'm sorry, let me add one more. Ramadan is the month of the Quran. And a lot of us, we wait until the first night of Taraweeh to begin our khatm, right? We say, okay, let's get the Quran off the shelf and let's begin Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and we start. I want us to make a commitment to each other here in this room that we're going to start that today. We don't need to wait. We don't need to wait. We can continue our khatm during Ramadan. We might complete one khatm and begin a second. The Prophet ﷺ used to review the whole Quran during the month of Ramadan, but we should be reading Quran even now. So today, inshallah, all of us will go home and we will at least read some of what we previously memorized, some of what we hope to memorize, some of the surahs we haven't read in a while, or we'll begin at the beginning and try to take our time and really allow it to sink into our hearts so that when Ramadan begins, we're already a step ahead. Okay, so that was the introduction of the talk, inshallah. But really, I just wanted to say there is much we can do right now. And none of us knows if we will even live until the first day of Ramadan. So if we begin today with the intention, oh Allah, I am doing these things to prepare for Ramadan so that I can do my best in Ramadan. And then God forbid we don't see that first day of Ramadan. Then with that intention, we will be rewarded as if we had performed the whole month. Subhanallah, this is the grace and mercy of Allah. So, Bismillah, to do from an angle that maybe we haven't looked at before, or that maybe we know about but we don't take maybe enough time to focus on. And so the talk is going to be divided up into 3 parts. The first part is an introduction, and I think that while we're doing the introduction, you guys are going to look at me like, Sister Marwa, do you know that this is supposed to be about Ramadan? You're going to think this has nothing to do with Ramadan. But that introduction is really going to lay a framework upon which we're going to build ideas and concepts that are going to help us a lot, inshallah, to have the best Ramadan, inshallah. So after the introduction, there will be 2 other parts. One part, we're going to look at the goals and the purpose of fasting during Ramadan. Why? Why do we do it? And then we're going to look at what I call the gifts of Ramadan. And we'll look at the benefits and the blessings and the virtues of the month as the Prophet ﷺ described them to us. So this first part, the introduction, inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in various verses in the Quran tells us that He created the heavens and the earth and the night and the day. And He goes on and on and on to list aspects of His creation. Now, all of those verses have something in common. They tell us that creation, that physical aspect of our universe, is not just supposed to be a blank, a canvas around us. It's not just supposed to be background. Allah tells us that in that physical creation, in those signs of the universe, in the hills, in the clouds, in the trees, in all of that is a sign. A sign. For whom? In one verse, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ, for a people who use their minds. In another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it is a sign for ulil albab. Ulil albab are the people who have this faculty of al-lub. Lub is like the highest cognitive function. So the people who are using their mind in the best way. So these are all signs for us. They are signs for us. We're supposed to reflect on them. We're supposed to learn from them. And we're supposed to use them internally to connect more with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To journey with our hearts more towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are physical acts of worship that we do in Islam. Actually, recently I was with a group of young people. And I told each of them, we went around the circle and I said, let's say someone who isn't Muslim comes to you and says, hey, you're Muslim, tell me about Islam. What would you tell them? And by and large, these young people, they were between like 3rd and 6th grade. They said, oh, well, I would tell them that Islam is to believe in one God and to pray. And Islam is to pray. And it is to read the Quran. And they kept listing these things that were actions. They were physical acts of worship. So a lot of times we actually reduce Islam to these active physical forms of worship. But what we fail to realize is that when the Prophet ﷺ told us about the 5 pillars of Islam, when he told us about the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he told us about prayer and fasting and charity and hajj, he said, "Buni al-Islamu ala khams." He said, Islam was built on those 5. Islam is not just those 5. And to have a holistic and proper understanding of Islam, we have to understand that every physical act of worship is supposed to have an effect on our inside, on our internal image, on our hearts, on our character. The Prophet ﷺ says, verily I was sent to perfect. Now someone who doesn't know about Islam might say, I was sent to perfect prayer. I was sent to perfect people's worship. But the Prophet ﷺ tells us, verily I was sent to perfect good character. So everything we do in Islam is supposed to come back to us inside. Inside. So what does that have to do with anything? Let us see, inshallah. There is a physical law of the universe. Remember, we said the universe is not just a canvas. It's not just beautiful background for which to look at and enjoy. It is a sign for us. So even in the physical laws of the universe, in how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the molecules and the atoms to work and come together, there are signs for us. Now, I don't know about you all, but I did not like physics. I really didn't. I liked math, but I didn't like physics. But one thing that I remember very well from physics, and it always made me think, subhanallah, was this idea of entropy. There's a law in physics, it's called the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, and I'm just going to call it the law of entropy. And what this law says is that in any system, the molecules of that system, if they begin and they're all ordered and they're structured, with time, they will get more and more disordered. They will lose structure. That is entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. If you clean your daughter's room, and it's perfect. Everything is in its place. There's no dust anywhere. And your daughter lives in that room. She sleeps in the room and she changes her clothes and she plays with her toys and she reads her books, and no energy is input to that system. There's no input of energy into that bedroom. What is it going to look like after 1 week? It's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a mess. With no input of energy, things will get more and more disorganized. They will fall apart. This happens at a molecular level. This is why ice melts. Because when water is frozen, its molecules are more structured. They are more orderly. They are solid. But if left to itself without the input of energy, then those molecules will disperse. They will want to get away from each other. They don't want to be close together. So that is, subhanAllah, the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy will always increase. Disorder will always increase if we don't do something to maintain the system. I feel like I'm screaming because the kids are so loud, but if you all can't hear me, let me know. Or if you feel like I'm screaming at you, forgive me and just do like this. Tell me to quiet my voice down. Okay, subhanAllah. Is a sign. How is that a sign? Well, let's look at this example. If I build this beautiful house and I say, oh, it's perfect, alhamdulillah, it's complete. And then I tell my kids and my grandkids, look, Allah has blessed us with a perfect, beautiful house. You know what we're going to do? We're going to move into an apartment across town. We're not going to touch it. We're not going to do anything with it. We're not going to maintain it. We're just going to see it from the exterior and admire its beauty outwardly. What's going to happen to that house few generations down the road, 200 years down the road? Yeah, right, exactly, subhanAllah. It's going to look like this. It's going to look like this. This is entropy in action. This is what happens if things are just left to the elements. So that's at the level of the physical. Now think about the level of the spiritual. Because we are a system. We are filled with systems. We have a respiratory system, we have a digestive system, we have a nervous system. All of those are systems, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't just make us physical beings. And Allah tells us that so many places in the Quran. Allah gave us a ruh and gave us a qalb, gave us a spiritual system. And if we don't know what that system is, then we can't take care of it. And if we don't understand its components and how they're supposed to work together, then we cannot keep it functioning effectively. What is that spiritual system? For the sake of our talk today, I'm just going to reduce it to these three components. But there's a whole branch of Islamic science that talks about the science of the nafs. It talks about the study of Islamic psychology. And it's a huge field. And growing up Muslim in the United States, I did not know much about this field. And I feel like it was to my detriment. I would have really benefited from knowing about this field. So the entities that make up our spiritual navigational system, for the sake of this talk, are our heart, our brain, and our nafs. Okay, now I know you guys are all like, Marwa, we're supposed to talk about Ramadan. What are you doing? Just bear with me, because inshallah this will help us. This will help us as we get. So I want to briefly tell us what each of these components does. The heart is a container, and it is meant to be filled with iman. It is meant to be filled with knowledge, spiritual perception, knowledge, understanding. It is meant to help us know Allah. That is the purpose of the heart. It is that part of us that gives us peace, serenity, and tranquility. If our heart is diseased, we will not find peace, serenity, or tranquility. And it is that part of us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses to guide us. It is like a compass. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the hypocrites. And what does He say? He says, فِي قُلُوبِهِم مَرَضٌ فَزَادَهُمَ اللَّهُ مَرَضًا. And there is nobody more misguided than the hypocrites. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them saying, in their hearts is a disease. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases them in disease, i.e. in misguidance. So it is that part of us that is guided or misguided. What is our brain? Well, for the purposes of our talk today, our brain is what takes in information from the environment, processes that information, and then along with our heart allows us to act on that information. If our brain takes in things that are beneficial, knowledge that is useful, then our heart and our brain work together to grow closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if our brain is looking at things that displease Allah and taking in information through the ears that displeases Allah and using the mouth and the limbs to do things that displease Allah, then that information comes in, the stimuli goes in, it gets processed, and it actually affects our heart negatively. Our heart becomes veiled. The Quran tells us that when people disobey Allah, there is a ran, there is a veil put upon their heart. كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ in Surah Al-Mutaffifin. Thank you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the people who disobeyed Allah, that what they did caused their heart to be veiled. And that's why you can talk to someone and say, look, don't you understand that you need to do this good act? And they're like, no, why? They don't see it. Their heart is blinded. And what is the nafs? So in the context of our psychological system, the nafs is that part of us that wants to fulfill the lower drives, wants, and desires. The nafs is concerned with here and now. You tell your nafs, work for Jannah, and it's like, no, I want to have my, frappuccino and chill out. That's what the nafs wants to do. It wants here and now. It seeks physical pleasure. Spiritual pleasure is not a thing of the nafs. It wants physical pleasure. It wants to eat, drink, and be entertained. It wants to fulfill sexual desire. That is a very big component of the nafs as well that we don't always think about. And this is huge. It seeks power and status. It wants people to appreciate it. It's the part of us that wants validation from the creation, the nafs. The heart wants validation from Allah, but the nafs wants people to say, look, that person is so great. And it's going to say, yeah, I am. It is prone to pride, self-aggrandizement, and it wants to feel better than others. So, we are on a journey, just like these little kids. We are on a journey. Our spiritual navigational system is supposed to help us on this journey. This is not a journey that we're going to use our legs to run on or to use our hands and feet to crawl on. It's a journey of our hearts. And Prophet Ibrahim in the Quran describes the day of judgment as a day when nothing will benefit anyone except the person, and he doesn't say except the person who has a sound heart. He says the person who comes to Allah. So it is a movement. It's a movement of our hearts toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spiritually. He says, إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. Those are the people who will be saved on the day of judgment. So we are on a journey. The Prophet ﷺ was asked about taqwa, and he pointed to his heart and he said, taqwa is here. And then he repeated it, taqwa is here. And he repeated it again, taqwa is here. Our mind can understand things intellectually, but intellect without taqwa is disastrous. It really is disastrous. Because if the heart is not engaged at all, there are some things that logical reasoning do not explain. And if you are only relying on logical reasoning, you will disappoint yourself so much. Because you might do everything for a certain outcome to happen. But if Allah does not will that outcome, it won't happen. And your logical reasoning won't make sense. But to the Muslim, when the heart is engaged, even if we strive and our outcome is not as we expect, we know we have cultivated in our hearts certainty that this is for the best. And that is how the heart leads the brain. The biggest enemies of the heart are the nafs and shaitan. And actually, shaitan uses the nafs to get to the heart of the mu'min. The nafs is the vehicle. It's kind of like a taxi. Shaitan hops on, says, hey, let's go do this thing. It's really destructive for your iman. Let's do it. And the nafs is affecting the heart, and the heart falls prey to the nafs, and the person does the act of disobedience, and the heart becomes blinded a little bit. And next time shaitan wants to come and attack the heart via the vehicle of the nafs, it's a little bit easier because the heart is already blinded a little bit if that person didn't repent. So it's like a vicious cycle. Okay, So that was the introduction. I know you all are like, okay, Marwa, come on, please bring this home because I'm so lost. But I promise it'll all make sense, inshallah. So what does fasting have to do with any of this? You know, I was talking with someone and they said to me, in our country, which was not the United States, in our country, Ramadan was like, you know, you have these lavish iftars and you party, you have fun with your family and your friends, and it's all social and mingling, and then there's like all this awesome entertainment on TV, and you sit and you watch these like shows, and they're like soap opera shows, and you can't wait for tomorrow till iftar time for the next show, and then you stay up all night with your friends, and then you pray fajr, and then you sleep until dhuhr, and then you pray dhuhr if you're like practicing. That would be the practicing Muslim. You pray dhuhr, and then you sleep until asr, and then you wake up at asr and mama's already like cooking the yummy iftar food that we're gonna have tonight. And that's Ramadan. Ramadan is not meant to be about this, and I do not actually absolve myself of that thinking either, because for a time in my life I didn't know any better. You know, even living in the United States, when I would visit my cousins, they'd be like, oh, you have to come for Ramadan. And they would describe that lifestyle to me. And I would want to go for Ramadan because I didn't know any better. I didn't know what Ramadan was supposed to be about. The ayat of Ramadan came down in Medina after 13 years of Aqidah in Mecca. The Quran, the Mecca Quran, is all about Aqidah. It's all about who is Allah. What is the day of judgment? What is your relationship to Allah? That's it. Mecca Quran is like, that's it. It's just Aqidah. And then you get to Madani Quran and you start seeing, okay, kutiba alaykum siyam. That's when fasting was prescribed. After people already had that. So I don't blame societies that don't have any exposure to the basic elements of our Aqidah for looking at Quran like a big holiday festival, you know, let's eat all the iftari foods that we can, sort of thing. I don't blame them, but we have to make ourselves better so that we can help, you know, our ummah, inshallah. So what does fasting have to do? There's a mysterious equation of fasting. It's kind of weird, and that's what we're going to focus on in this next part, the goals and purpose of Ramadan and fasting. We subtract something in Ramadan. We subtract when we fast, not just in Ramadan. Anytime we fast, we subtract. We subtract first food, drink, and physical relations between spouses. Those are all like tangible, physical things. We subtract those. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. You do this, you fast. Fasting was prescribed upon you so that you can attain taqwa. Is taqwa material? Can I look at, you know, the sister and say, oh, mashallah, mashallah, the taqwa is just like steaming out of her head. I see it. I can measure it. No, it's not. It's not material. It's not actually at all material. It is something totally in al-ghaib. Even the Prophet ﷺ, when the Sahaba would accuse someone of accepting Islam insincerely, he would say, did you split open their chest and look at their heart? No. So we don't have access to that dimension. How do we gain something that is totally not material by giving up things that are very material? Bread, cheese, dates, you know, I give this up, but yet I gain something intangible. So that's what we're going to focus on, subhanAllah, right now. We said that our hearts are on a journey. And I don't know if any of you have ever participated in like a workout regimen. If you've ever had like a goal, like, okay, I want to run a 5K or I want to run a 10K. I used to actually be like kind of a runner and I actually trained for a marathon, alhamdulillah, which is 40K. It's really long, 26 miles. So if you look at how people train for these like really big sporting activities, you see that in the beginning, their training is very simple. Their training does not involve a lot of obstacles. So what does that mean? Like if you're going to run, you're supposed to start running slowly on a flat and level plane, not doing lots of hills, not going on lots of rocky surfaces. You're supposed to do that because you want your heart, your physical heart, to get in better shape, and you want your muscles to get stronger. And you don't want to expose them to something that would injure them when they haven't developed enough strength. So again, remember, in the physical universe, there's always a sign for us. There's always something that applies to our spiritual journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if physically, when we train our physical bodies, we have to start with little resistance, little obstacles, and work up to the more challenging aspects of training. So we are training our hearts, subhanallah. So the spiritual training of our hearts, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designs it in a way that is very similar to the physical training of our bodies through fasting. I want to start, actually, before we get into the ayah about Ramadan, the ayahs about fasting. The fiqh of fasting is really straightforward. When you compare it to the fiqh of Hajj, or the fiqh of Salah, or the fiqh of like marriage, zawaj, the fiqh of fasting is super easy. It involves two things. It involves having an intention, having a niyyah, and it involves abstaining from what you're supposed to abstain from. That's pretty much it. You can get into like a little bit of, details, like if I use an inhaler, does that break my fast? Things like that. But overall, it's very, very simple. But subhanallah, fasting is supposed to give us something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran over 200 times, which is taqwa. So understanding how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses fasting, something that seems relatively simple in terms of its fiqh, to give us something that is so, emphasized in the Quran, is why I thought we would look at these ayat and try to sort of decipher a little bit of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses fasting and Ramadan to train our hearts. So the introduction of our talk was really just about our spiritual navigational system. It was telling us that we are made up of different parts, and that for that navigational system to function, every part needs to carry out its role. And most specifically, the heart, the thing that receives guidance, the thing that holds our iman and has taqwa, that has to be winning its battle with the nafs, which is always going to pull on us towards worldly and base desires. So here's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents it. I'll be honest with you all, until I started preparing this talk and listening to the tafsir of these ayat, I never noticed this. I never noticed this sequence of ideas. I never noticed how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets this up for us really as a training for our hearts. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. So the first ayah about fasting is about fasting in general. It says when you fast, when you give up the things that are halal for you, food and drink, and the intimate relationship between spouses, when you do this during the day, in essence what you are doing is you are allowing your heart to gain spiritual muscle in its fight against the nafs. Just like a runner who starts training, starts running on, easy surfaces and starts running at a slower pace, your heart is starting to win these small battles against the nafs. These are not complicated battles. It's not like, should I twist the truth about this thing, or should I maybe cheat in this small little tiny way, or should I hold or harbor this anger towards someone, or should I feel the envy that I'm feeling? Those are all also important matters in Islam, but they're not as easy, they're not as tangible, they're not as easy to figure out. But looking at food and saying, I'm not going to eat this, that's relatively straightforward. So you train your heart to develop spiritual muscle against your nafs. You feel thirsty, the nafs is like, oh, water would be so nice now. And your heart says, no way. You feel hungry, and your nafs is like, oh, cheeseburger would be so yummy now. And you say to your nafs, no way. And then there are other elements of the fast, and we're going to talk about those. But the nafs says, oh, why don't we just pass the time by watching some really stupid R-rated movie or something. And then your heart says, no, it's Ramadan. Read Quran. Do something. You're going to get extra benefit. Don't let this time pass. Or your nafs says, oh, why don't you call up so-and-so? You have this really juicy story about what so-and-so did and so-and-so said, and she doesn't know about it yet. You can tell her. And your heart says, no, we're not going to talk about people. Your heart develops spiritual strength and muscle through fasting. Because by giving up these very straightforward and tangible things, you allow your heart to win battles over the nafs. And it develops spiritual muscle in a way that nothing else can do, subhanAllah. Nothing else does this like fasting. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to go on. I didn't finish the verse, but that was really the main point about how fasting trains our heart and allows it to develop taqwa by gaining spiritual strength against the nafs. Because taqwa at the end of the day is a consciousness of Allah, so that we don't do what displeases Allah and we stay steadfast on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the month of Ramadan. And this is interesting because the first ayah didn't even mention Ramadan. So now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. The month of Ramadan is when the Quran was sent down. The Quran has been described in the Quran as, in the Quran itself, the Quran is described in the Quran as a cure for what is in the heart. The Quran that is sent down in Ramadan is a cure for our hearts. In the previous verse we were told fasting helps your heart gain spiritual strength. Now we're told, in this month I sent you something that is a cure for your hearts. And what else? Hudan linnas, a guidance for people. What part of us follows guidance? Our heart. Our heart follows guidance. So the Quran is not only a shifa for our hearts, it is guidance that is followed by our hearts. وَبَيِّنَاتٍ مِّنَ الْهُدَى. So if you even have doubt or people are like, how do you know this is guidance? There's clear proof that it is guidance. But clear proof only for those with a sound heart. Subhanallah. And then, criterion, Furqan. Furqan is the criteria by which you judge the right from the wrong, by which you know truth from falsehood. What part of us distinguishes truth from falsehood? It's not our brain, it's our heart. Subhanallah. So, whoever of you witnesses the month, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرِ. That part of the ayah kind of shakes me. Because it's saying that not all of us are going to witness the month. Not all of the Muslims are going to witness the month. And I'm thinking of examples of people who passed away this last year that had no idea that they were not going to witness Ramadan in 3 weeks. Their time came and they died, and they were not at all thinking that they were not going to witness Ramadan. So none of us ever knows. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, so if you were lucky enough to be among the people who witnessed Ramadan, this month in which you received the Quran and the guidance and the ability to know truth from falsehood, then what should you do? You should fast. Why? Because fasting increases your heart's spiritual muscle. It allows you to take advantage of all that was sent to you in Ramadan. Subhanallah. And then Allah tells us Allah intends for you ease and does not intend for you hardship. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Okay, fasting is not easy. I personally sometimes have a very hard time physically getting through the day. But what's harder than that is living a life where our heart is veiled from guidance. There are people who have billions of dollars, but they do not have the guidance. And because of some minor loss in their lives, they commit suicide. And this is documented. People who have everything, who are just hollow shells. So what's even harder than the physical aspects of fasting are the diseases or the veil that will be on our heart if we don't undergo this spiritual training. This spiritual training helps make our life easy by strengthening our heart and allowing us to benefit from the guidance Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent us. And there's so much more, subhanAllah, that can be said about this ayah, but the last part of this ayah doesn't say so that perhaps you will be pious, perhaps you will be great, perhaps you will be have taqwa, but it says so that perhaps you will be grateful, as if this month and the guidance we receive and the spiritual muscle we develop in our heart by fasting, the ability now to see truth from falsehood and not be in a state of confusion, those are great, great blessings that we must show gratitude for, subhanAllah. So just to recap what we've talked about so far, the goals and the purpose of fasting and Ramadan. Fasting, by and large, in general, helps us increase in taqwa. It helps our heart develop spiritual strength by combating the nafs. Ramadan is especially amazing because it was the time when the Quran was revealed. The relationship of Ramadan to the Quran is a direct one. During Ramadan, we reconnect with the Quran. And in order to most benefit from it, we are also fasting so that our heart is able to receive that guidance better and follow the truth from the falsehood better. And then this last verse that I wanted us to look at is a beautiful verse about dua. And sometimes people say, well, what does that have to do with Ramadan? But dua, the Prophet ﷺ described dua as the essence of our worship. It is the heart of our ibadah. We should never leave dua, ever. And when we are fasting, especially, the Prophet ﷺ told us that for the fasting person, there are two times when they are happy. At the time when they break their fast, and at the end of the month when they meet their Lord and they have finished the whole period on the day of Eid. And also it is explained, on the day when they meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. So when we break our fast, the Prophet ﷺ tells us that this is a time when we should make dua, when dua is accepted. So although dua is something we should be doing all the time, during Ramadan it's even more emphasized. And when Allah talks to us about dua, and I think most of us have probably heard this before, but it's really amazing. There are many, many verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, and if they ask you about this, tell them this. And if they ask you about this, tell them that. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسَرِ قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَثِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعَ لِلنَّاسِ. They ask you about drinking and gambling. Tell them that in them is harm and some benefit, but their harm greatly outweighs their benefit. But the equation in this verse is different. The equation in this verse says, when my servants ask you, I am near. There's no tell them, O Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. It's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, there's no mediator. There's nothing between my servant and me. I am near. I am here. And I am ready to respond to the invocation at any time. SubhanAllah, there's a lot in the tafsir of this verse, and I don't want to take much more of our time, subhanAllah, but it's beautiful, beautiful. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that even though He is the highest, the Rabb, and He describes us as servants or slaves, we are the lowest. There's nothing separating us from Him. And that any time we call upon Him, He will respond. And then he advises us, so let them respond to me. فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي. Don't tell them not to turn their backs on what I have sent them of guidance. Let them obey what I have told them to do. وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي. And let them have faith in me. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. It doesn't say لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, لَعَلَّهُمْ يُفْلِحُونَ. It doesn't say so that they will have taqwa or so that they will be successful, even though a lot of other verses end like that. This one says so that they will be guided. There's so much emphasis on what the heart does. The heart is where taqwa lives. The heart is what can receive knowledge and guidance from the Quran and establish right from wrong. And the heart is what you're involving when you make dua. I don't know. I mean, some people can just like say Ameen after a sheikh and kind of like, just think about something else. But when you yourself, when you make dua, when you call upon Allah, because this is not the one who, this is very, very personal. It's saying, I respond to the caller when he calls. So when you make dua, it's very hard not to engage your heart. It's like you have to engage your heart. You can't ask from your Lord without feeling something in your heart. And so again, Allah tells us, when you do that, you will stay on the straight path. You will be rightly guided. Because again, you are involving that inner dimension of your heart that otherwise sometimes just gets left to the side. So we already kind of did this recap of the ayat that talk about fasting. When we emerge from Ramadan, our hearts are stronger and more prepared for the 11 months ahead. It's like the person who's been training and training and training for a race. They get to that race, even if it's 40 miles, even if it's 100 miles. I mean, people train for crazy, crazy long races. But if they've trained correctly, they can complete the race. One scholar, he was saying Ramadan is like, like a catapult. You pull back on the band until it's so tense. And you do so much in Ramadan for your heart. And then you let it go. And your heart becomes like a projectile. And it goes way farther than that initial point. It goes 11 months until the next Ramadan with what you have done for it in that 1 month. So that's what we're striving for, subhanAllah. Our iman is increased and we are more guided than before. And we have rekindled a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through our dua that makes us better able to stay on the straight path, to be of the Rashidun, to be of the people who are rightly. So this last part is very quick, but I didn't want to end, subhanAllah, without covering some of what the Prophet ﷺ told us about this month. Because I feel like when you look at this, you leave and you're like, oh, I can't wait for Ramadan. I can't wait for that. And I think someone explained it best when they said, sometimes we walk into a store and we see stuff and we're like, oh, I really like that. I really like that jacket. I really like that purse. And then we look at the price and we're like, okay, I'm going to wait. It'll go on sale. And we check back and we check back and we check back. And then 70% off. Yes, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get 5, And sometimes we buy stuff because it's on sale and we don't even need it. And we're just like, it was so cheap, I had to get it. And that's not really the spirit of Islam. We're not really supposed to be excessive like that. But when it comes to Ramadan, it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, all of those acts of worship that you're used to doing, they are on sale. You are going to get so much more for what you pay. They are on sale, so do more. And so I want us to cut. They're like gifts, subhanAllah. So the Prophet ﷺ, on the last day of Sha'ban, so 1,450 some years ago, around this time, subhanAllah, he said, O people, a great month has come over you, a blessed month, a month in which is a night better than 1,000 months, a month in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it obligatory upon you to fast during the day and voluntary upon you to pray during the night. Whoever draws nearer to Allah by performing an optional good deed, so a sunnah, 2 rak'ahs before dhuhr, in this month shall receive the same reward as performing an obligatory deed in another month. Big sale. Subhanallah. And whoever performs an obligatory deed in this month shall receive the reward of performing 70 obligatory deeds at other than this month. So 70%, it's not 70%, it's 700%. I mean, we get excited when something is 70% off. We're getting 700 times what we would have gotten otherwise. It is the month of patience, and the reward of patience is Al-Jannah. Now you guys, patience doesn't mean just not eating and drinking, and I'm saying this to myself first, because my goal every Ramadan is to increase my patience outside of food and drink, to increase my patience with my girls, to increase my patience with the clutter that never ends in the house, to increase my patience with performing my prayers in a way that would really be befitting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So
those things increase with the decrease of consumption. You become more angry, you become more active.
subhanallah, yes, and I wish it were not the case, but I'm like, my girls know, they're like, Mama, are you fasting today? And they just scatter, they just run, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to scare you, I'm gonna be good, I'm gonna be nice. So yeah, when you're not eating and drinking, you know what it is? Here's what it is. Your nafs at that time is already feeling constrained. And subhanAllah, have you ever heard of a supersonic jet? A supersonic jet is a plane that can break the sound barrier. But before it breaks the sound barrier, the resistance of the air on that plane is so great. It is so great. So that plane is going and going, and there's all this resistance, and there's all this resistance, and then it achieves the speed at which it breaks the speed of sound, and you hear a supersonic boom. You hear this huge boom. That is the nafs. You're fasting, you're fasting, you're fasting, you're fasting, you're being patient, you're being patient. You almost explode, but then you get there, and then there's no sound. The plane goes through the air without making a sound. So we have to be patient. We have to be patient with ourselves, with our nufus, and understand that they're undergoing a lot, but continue to be patient and continue to improve, because then at one point it gets to be easy. And this is what scholars say. My personal experience has not gotten there yet. I mean, I pray to be among those who feel that. And I could say maybe at some point in my life I've had like a taste of it, where fasting is not hard, where you enjoy it. How could I not pray? I love it. That feeling of worship. Yeah, subhanallah. So we pray to be among those people who really, really enjoy the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made obligatory upon us. So it is the month of patience, and the reward of patience is Jannah. It is the month of charity, and a month in which a believer's rizq is increased. Even when you're spending in charity, your provision is increased. Whoever gives food to a fasting person to break his fast shall have his sins forgiven, and will be saved from the punishment of Allah, and he will have the same reward as the fasting person, without the fasting person's reward being diminished at all. There are so many ahadith, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, but I want to just, subhanallah, another one. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that every deed we do will receive 10 to 700 times the reward. So it's multiplied by somewhere between 10 to 700. All except the fasting. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that fasting is for me, and I shall reward it as I like. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even tell us how much reward we're going to get when we're fasting. The Prophet ﷺ tells us when the month of Ramadan starts, the gates of heaven are opened and the gates of hell are closed and the devils are chained. And subhanAllah, I don't think that we could do what we do in Ramadan if shaitan was with us. It's enough that we're battling our nafs, but if shaitan was there, it would have been very hard. So it is as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us a gradual training. He's saying, during this month, I'm removing obstacles. Now you do your part, and you will emerge stronger. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that the fast and the Quran are two intercessors for the servant of Allah on the day of resurrection. The fast will say, "Oh Allah, I prevented him from his food and desires during the day. Let me intercede for him." The Quran will say, "I prevented him from sleeping at night. Let me intercede for him." And their intercession will be accepted. Subhanallah. There are so many hadith. I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, but I think that I would encourage all of us to look up the hadith related to Ramadan, because when we look at them and we think about them, especially with the background of how Ramadan and fasting affect our heart, help us reorient our spiritual navigational system, help us reconnect the physical acts of worship, with how, the effect they're supposed to have inside of us. I feel like those ahadith take on a whole new light, really, in that regard. So Ramadan is the month of forgiveness. There is blessing in our worship. There's blessing in our time. We just have to be aware of it and how we use it. There's multiplied reward. The devils are chained, and there is protection from Allah's punishment. Subhanallah. And so my parting advice is going to be very fast. Subhanallah. The scholars and Imam al-Ghazali specifically talk about levels of fasting. There's the fasting of the ordinary person where you just give up food and drink. Then there's the fasting of the select servants of Allah, where you watch what your eyes see, and you watch what your ears hear, and you watch everything that you're doing, and you avoid excess, especially at the time of iftar. That's one of the things that Imam al-Ghazali mentions. 6 things he mentions, but one of them is that you avoid eating too much even at the time of iftar. That raises you a rank in your fast. And then the last level of the fasting is those whose heart is fasting as well, whose heart does not become preoccupied by anything of this dunya except what they have to do. Their heart only sees Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reason I wanted to talk about that at the end is that sometimes we start Ramadan and we feel like the way that we fasted on the first day of Ramadan is pretty much the same way we fasted on the last day of Ramadan. So let us try to improve the quality of our fast this month. Because kind of like water, when water is flowing, it's going to remain clean and clear and pure and fresh. We become complacent the minute we stand in one place and we say, okay, I know how to fast, I'm good here. I don't really have to read more Quran. I don't really have to watch what I listen to or what I look at or what I talk about. I'm fasting. That's when our water stagnates. And stagnant water is filthy. It's never pure. It's a breeding ground for diseases and bacteria and mosquitoes. And one of the scholars tells us, indeed, I have seen that the dormancy of water causes it to become contaminated. When it rushes, it is sweet and pure, and when it stagnates, it is far from sweet. And he said this about our iman, that we should never be complacent with our iman. We should never say, I've done enough. We should never just stop. We should always be improving. Pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to do that and accepts from us Ramadan. This is really not the end, it's only the beginning. We should all inshallah continue to learn about Ramadan, and I think Sister Aisha is going to share with us the fiqh of Ramadan. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to witness Ramadan and begin the month even more prepared for it than we've ever been, with our hearts and with our minds and physically in all ways, inshallah. May Allah accept from us, and jazakumullahu khairan for your attention, and I apologize if I was speaking so loudly.